Can hear me. It's 6 o'clock and we welcome you to our third edition of our COVID-19 talk sessions organized by V4SDG. So this is the third talk. We already had one on the environmental dimension and the social dimension, which are both rewatchable on YouTube, and we share the links. So if you're interested in the two other episodes, please watch those. And we have another one on the 24th of June, which is our last debate session between all of the speakers that we've had so far. But I'm gonna mention this also later. Myself, I am working in I'll be moderating this talk, and I'm working for the communications team for V4SDG. Besides that, I'm a student of environment and resource management at VU Amsterdam. And I've been working in the energy and sustainability field for a few years now, and currently being involved in clean tech and renewable investments. About V4SDG, so our objective is basically to strengthen the partnership on the sustainable development goals of the UN in the Visegrad area, which is much needed. I feel like we are doing this via a handful of projects. For example, we have a project called V4SDG Compass, which is our advocacy initiative for a Visegrad sustainability minimum in the region. We have V4SDG Exchange, which is a chain of events that are strengthening the intersectional dialogue in this partnership on the SDGs between the four countries. And this involves our Budapest Sustainability Exchange, which takes place in September 23rd and 24th in Brody Studios, which we cordially invite you all to. And also our past conferences at all the capitals of the V4 countries. We also currently have open positions. So if you would like to work with us, please visit v4sdg.com for recruitment and see our open positions. And you can always find more information about our organization on the website, or just send us an email. So the schedule of this talk is going to be the following. We will set the scene quickly for 5 minutes with our speaker Ákos. Then we will have a 25-minute discussion on the interlinkages between COVID-19 and our economies. And then the rest 20 minutes will be dedicated to Q&A. So you can pose your questions on the Q&A button down there, and I will see all of that. And I will ask our speaker about it, and then I will close the talk just before 7. So before we set the scene, I would like to welcome Ákos to this talk, who is a sustainability expert who has over 15 years of experience in climate change and sustainability. He has worked a lot with emissions trading for quite a while. He also worked for the Hungarian government, where under his professional leadership, Hungary was the first among the EU members to endorse and incorporate the Paris Agreement and into national legislation. So that's a big thing. And at Deloitte, he is the leader of the sustainability service line and oversees projects for key corporate clients, including climate risk assessment, emissions trading, environmental projects, energy audits, and much, much more. Ákos, it's a pleasure to have you here. And maybe I will ask you to set the scene a little bit with your opinion on COVID, how it's going, what we're seeing, and what's really important to discuss with regards to the topic. And welcome.
Thank you very much for the nice invitation. I see we sound like I have a lot of work to do, and during these days, after and in between the COVID-19 crisis, it's right. My main message is that sustainability has not been dropped by the economic players, and this is not because anybody wanted it, but definitely those values that sustainable supply chain or a business has, it has its advantages during this collapse of the economy, and that part of the economy has collapsed that was stretching the conditions of the globalized capital markets. And those remained resilient, who were rather resilient already by the nature of their sustainable setup. So I'm very happy I'm invited, and I'm happy to give my thoughts and answer the questions also today. I think we will hopefully touch upon, and we'll have time to look at how governments are acting. There are some governments that are putting green recovery on their flags and are trialing how to make it now different than in 2007, 8, 9, and 10. How not to get back to a safety first scenario, but to get to a safety first and a climate first scenario where climate is also playing an equal role, including all the sustainability aspects. And I'm happy to elaborate a little on how companies are doing and what are the challenges that they face and how those are doing better, that are sustainable, and what are the main risks for those who were not prepared for this crisis from a business model point of view, and have to change and have to watch out for the future and be more resilient. So these aspects, I think, are showing a landscape of even more growing demand for sustainability and resilience. And if we just take the European Union, inevitably all the policy actions and regulatory changes are just triggering this effect further and further.
I agree, and we're looking forward to a very fruitful discussion then. I have a few questions prepared, and also, as said, you can all pose your questions in the Q&A part, and we will turn to them later after we've discussed everything we have in mind now. So my first question would be, how the crisis will reshape our economies, and also from the local to the global level. So we have seen our sectors, so some sectors more affected than others. We have seen our habits and thus our consumption change drastically. Our supply chains are disrupting. What is this the sign of? Should we really localize or like deglobalize our economies, and what implications does all of this have for economies on a global and also maybe in a regional level, as we're here to discuss Visegrad aspects too.
I mean, that's true that there is a sign like global things would become more local, like the economy itself. And for some sectors, it is actually a strengthening factor for already decided reshuffling of the economy. Like if we look at the US or Germany, in many sectors and places in the industry, there were already demands of bringing back production from the East. And that in some sectors, due to the crisis, it has triggered the stop of the productions, and therefore there was a big demand on finding alternative ways of doing business. But I think if we want to find the proper answer to that, how the economy will be reshaped, we have to look at also the fundamental uncertainties that are there, that everybody has to explore and take into mind. The first is about to look at the severity of the pandemic and the pattern of the disease progression. I think this is a fundamental uncertainty that nobody knows how this will happen. Everybody talks about the first and second wave. Everybody's waiting for September and October in the northern hemisphere to find out whether this disease will go away or stay with us. And if you read the news, you get both of them. This is a big uncertainty, I think, for all businesses. The level of collaboration is again another factor taken into account the politics. Some countries collaborate in these issues. Like if you look at the EU, there is a big concerted action how to go further. But if you look at the trade wars between countries, then you will see that there could be big distortions and this concert between some countries. Third, very important is the healthcare system. How does that respond to the crisis? And as we could see in every country where there was a policy to flatten the curve, it was all relying on the healthcare system's quality, how it could handle, and in the long term, how it can handle the issue. The economic consequences of the crisis were different in different countries and sectors. Some that were already digitalized, they have boosted, and those who were not finding their right economic model in a digitalized world could not survive. And other factors like how we consume things like fresh vegetables, some markets have completely changed the pattern they can actually operate and deliver to the markets. And the last one is about the social cohesion, because in response to the crisis, there are social common factors and common responsibilities that we have to bear. And I think if we take these 5 things into account, like we follow these uncertainties, we will know what happens with the world economy. Would it go more localized, or would it remain global in some certain sectors? I think there are different scenarios for that.
Mm-hmm. I see, thank you. I think one thing we can surely say is that on the short term, there's huge financial deficit. And the second question relates to this actually. So how will government intervention in these national state economies change in the post-pandemic world? Because we have seen huge bailout programs by governments. You can also maybe bring a few great examples. They're really trying to prevent the collapse of our state economies. And I also wonder where this money is going to and how it's going to be repaid, and maybe good examples of economic stimulus that you can bring in the future of these well, investments, but they might not get it back.
Yeah, I think if we look at governments, what they do, we can start from the EU level, where, as you could see, just before the coronavirus crisis and the caused economic crisis, there was already a European Green Deal, which was a natural process of the EU, how to get to a more sustainable and actually a climate neutral European Union, which is a big word since the Paris Agreement. It has first phrased it, and the EU is on the path to deliver it. Every regulatory tool that the EU has is supporting these goals already before the crisis, and it has strengthened these goals. Why? There are 3 asset classes if we look at the impact of the crisis. The one is the economy that has collapsed and has lost a lot of trillions of GDP, and it has to regain its strengths, and hopefully in a sustainable way. If we look at the society has also lost a lot of its assets due to the fact that some of the economic sectors were not prepared for such a stress, and therefore people were losing their jobs. So there is a big loss on that. But if we look at the third one, like environment and climate, these are regaining a little strengths. We should not overestimate this, because this was nothing close to solving the climate problem. But still, it has shown that these 3 together do not yet correlate enough, and they do not bring the same strength to each other. So when we look at the EU target, which is a good example of today, it's like for 2030 you have a 40% target in CO2 reduction. Then this has to be raised. The EU sees it and has planned about that. And this can there is a debate, of course, and some people say it should be raised to 50-55%. This is in line with the European Commission, and some say that it has to be raised to 65%, like the European Parliament. So this is like one of the actions that that has been strengthened by the fact that emissions were dropped in this couple of last months in the EU. If we look at member states, what they are doing, because this is not really only a common policy that is driving economic growth, but if a single member state is opting for a carbon floor price, is opting for higher targets in renewables or energy efficiency, it is actually triggering the common European target to an even higher level. So if we look at a couple of member states who already support a green recovery, which is a new plan that couple of weeks ago was proposed, which has also new generation funding, then we can see that, for example, Germany has planned a 130 billion euro bailout plan, out of which 40 billion euro will be exclusively spent on climate-related expenses. And while, for example, the automotive sector wanted to receive still some funding for the cleanest fossil fuel engines in the sector, they haven't received that, and all the rest of the alternative fuel vehicles have received an additional funding, reducing value-added taxes. So a lot of vehicles are there, and clearly everybody's talking about the green recovery and the economy as something mainstream. Another country maybe to mention outside of the EU is Canada. In Canada, the large businesses were bound to publish an annual climate disclosure report, so that seeing that report, they can receive the bailout funding for COVID-19, a stimulus. Additionally to that, they had to report it not only for their own operations and products, but also for their supply chains. And beyond that, they had to produce also environmental reports on their sustainability goals. And this was a very interesting example of how brave a country can be to connect the green future with the current crisis. And this is very simple actually, because at the end of the day, anybody who wants to avoid similar collapse is looking for more resilient and more sustainable economy and businesses. And once you know this information, such as climate risk, sustainability risk on companies, you have a better view whether they serve the society or not, and how they serve it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So yeah, I think these countries are very interesting, and it's an ongoing policy, of course. So we do not see whether this will yield the results, but it's very promising and very nice to see that there are such brave countries to put this into the very first line in the forefront of the action against COVID-19.
Yeah, although it's also very timely with regards to the green recovery. And maybe let's go a bit more into the to what's happening in Europe, because European Commission just released its plan for a 750 billion euros recovery fund, which is of course aligned with the EU Green Deal and has the zero carbon objective as its goal. And I'm wondering really what instruments are we talking about when the EU says that this money can be used for this and this purpose only? And can this really be a momentum for the climate movement? I'm maybe like interested in what sectors could be affected and how the EU could enact this policy of sponsoring a green transition via also pulling out countries of the crisis. You're muted, Ákos.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So if we look at the new, I mean not the new, but the already existing budget of the EU that was not yet approved for the next 7 years of period, it is already consisting a lot of billions of euros, and part of it, like 25% of it is again related to climate finance. And I think the next generation EU tool is a new one which would help the financial markets to create that leverage that this already existing European budget can be leveraged by the new generation and by the new tools that are there for strengthened climate-related spendings. So I think it's like if we look at the areas of that, then this is basically helping the member states in different parts. You have a resilience tool. You have support for the cohesion policy. This is called the React EU, which is giving money for those areas that were also impacted by the virus. Then there is a strengthened rural area policy, where in these areas you have even a bigger impact of people being unemployed and jobs being lost. Then there is also money for the private sector, where the restart of the economy is really dependent on these type of subsidies. As we can see, you can get funding for strategic investments, reinforcing the already ongoing investments in the InvestEU program, or you can be supported to keep your solvency and keep the business running. Mm-hmm. And there is also a third part where it's about the resilience, how not to have a second crisis of such. And for that one, there is also part of the package for strengthening the healthcare system, which was failing in some of the countries to cope with this crisis, and also in research, innovation, and development. If we look at the development of how to produce a good vaccine against this crisis, it has also its lengths and of the process. So if you think these are the main parts of this package, and I think these will help the member states to change even for a more greener and sustainable operation.
I agree, and I think a very important aspect is that really this money cannot be spent to rescue those industries that are polluting our environment, and those which have to be phased out, including fossil fuel powered power plants and polluting industries and so on. So I think it's important to note that this money should really be spent on something more progressive than we have been seeing in the past few years. Another question maybe is about how, so what are the main scenarios or types of a resilient business leader? What is really for businesses, both small and medium, and how can they handle this?
If we look at what business leaders are doing, as I spoke about the uncertainties that are there, still people are looking at different scenarios, and different consultant firms have produced already their strategic directions. So in Deloitte and Salesforce has also coupled to have a dialogue with the scenario thinkers of the world in society and business. And 4 scenarios were created that can actually be some of the scenarios will be true. We don't know which one, but those trends that are showing that can be put in 4 brackets actually. The first is the passing the storm scenario, which means like we are all doing it right. It's an optimistic story. There is a vaccine soon developed rather sooner than later, or an existing drug can be repurposed for this effective treatment. Also, the disease might pass quicker than we expect, and there is a strong coordination between governments, and the damages can be minimized. Small businesses and lower income individuals would feel that these lasting implications are still there, but this is the best scenario where the severity of the pandemic is low, and also the significance of the cooperation between the collaboration between the governments, actually this is quite significant and high. If we look at another scenario, like we call it good company, that means that the companies are believing and having a trust following the crisis. Some potential shift is there for large companies to take a more integrated role, those who are more capable, more capitalized. In this scenario also there are longer disease trajectories, so not shorter ones. Governments have struggles to handle the crisis, and therefore companies are able to form partnerships and play a very important role in the life of communities and economies. I think part of this we could also see during the last months, where companies were standing out and supporting the society with any type of funding and charities. So I think that type of good company feature is there. This scenario has some opportunities for them, therefore, for the companies, action those businesses that they can and influence the consumers for a future scenario. There is a third one, which is about called it sunrise in the east. This means that the severity of the pandemic is still very high, and the collaboration is a kind of not so good, but it's still okay, it's still working. And if this pandemic lasts longer, but there is an uneven recovery, then we think that East Asian countries like China, Singapore, or Taiwan could have a very well orchestrated healthcare response, and being a bit more active, more coordinated, more effective of managing the disease. Of course, we see all the contrary of this, like we look at now China and how other breakouts of the virus could be seen there. But still, when we look at the beginning of this crisis, that was a quite quick action, and to flatten the curve, the Eastern countries were better. If we look at now at this moment the picture. So these nations would regain a primary power in this scenario on the world stage, wielding increasing political and economic influence also, and their centralized governments would become a kind of gold standard for other nations around the world. And we have the fourth scenario, which is about the lone wolves, where you have very loose cooperation between the governments, and you also have a very severe effect of the pandemic. This is the worst scenario no one wants to see, because here you are really in a high shape of isolation. The supply chains are really shortening and getting very local. Allies are falling apart, not really cooperating, but turning against one another. And the safeguarding of the people is the primary issue. But citizens are increasingly losing their faith in the legacy institutions, which makes them more vulnerable to demagoguery. So I think those are the four scenarios that we looked at. And if we want to think as a company, what can happen with us in the next 3 to 5 years, when these scenarios could come, one of them or a couple of them would become reality, then we should think maybe in 4 questions. What are previous expectations that need to be rethought? Many companies were facing a challenge of changing their operations as business models in a couple of days to survive. A second question is about what would be the biggest threats to the current business if these scenarios are becoming reality. And the third one is about how and which scenario is describing best the world that we have to prepare for, because this is changing on a weekly basis, I think, how people believe in one of these scenarios. So this is a very dynamic thing to watch out for the current operation as well, not only for the future. And the last question is really if someone is brave on that, to find out what should be done differently right now so that most of these scenarios can be handled easier, and that is creating, I think, the real space for change, and that change is coming through technologies and changes in how companies operated before.
Thank you for familiarizing us with the 4 scenarios. I also would agree that resilience is very key to any kind of operation of businesses, and it's really it will be interesting to see throughout the course of the next months and year how many businesses can still stay open and who has to close their doors for good. So it will be an exciting time for sure. Maybe a little bit back, and I'm very happy because we already have a few questions. A few more that I have. This one about sustainable finance. So let's get back to a bit to really financing the green transition that we want to make. What is the current situation of sustainable finance globally and also regionally maybe? And because this is a very important arm of our economies. And maybe let's talk a bit about green bond initiatives. The Hungarian government has actually issued green bonds recently. The EU is planning to develop a green bond standard in order to guide the countries on how to really steer investments into the expansion of green energy, any kind of green technologies. So how do you see that at the moment? And maybe talk a bit about these instruments.
Yeah, I think it's again a very interesting topic to look at, how the financing tools have actually been staying resilient against the virus. If we look at the current situation, like this morning, I had the privilege to talk on another conference which was about emission trading, and if we look at the price, which is a signal of the technology change and the energy transition of the European Union allowances, the quota price, it actually has regained strength and kept its strength, despite the fact that at the very same crisis 10-12 years ago, it has easily collapsed. So we live at a completely different time, and I think it can be counted from 2015 on, from the Paris Agreement, where investors were pledging and committing to help to fulfill the wishes and new policies of governments towards a more resilient and carbon neutral future and also nations. So these nations all produced their plans, which had to seek for financing. And from that moment on, it was clear that the world doesn't have enough projects, technologies at this moment that the investors will be eager to finance. So I think that's a very important point, because it is leading us to also the current sovereign green bond issuance of governments in Europe, like in France, Poland. There have been such issuances in the past, and the current Hungarian one shows also that there is a constant oversubscription and an overwhelming interest in finding green projects. And this is really a very hot market. And so the oversubscription of 5 times of the current sovereign green bond issuance of the government in Hungary was also a sign of that. If we look at a little bit the regulatory background, the EU has its own sustainable finance agenda, which is bringing in the European Green Bond also as a standard built on the climate and the green bond initiatives already existing around the world. And I think it's a very important step, because also the bankers, the financing industry, and also the issuer industries, like those who are already on the traditional bond market, or those who are looking at green loans by their banks, they all need to learn a little bit more to get a stronger pipeline of projects. And this is again bringing up another trend of the ESG, environmental, social, and governance funds, where you need to have metrics of these projects, and you need to measure your current performance. Rating agencies are actually rating your current performance, and you can improve that if you are doing better for these 3 domains. And these funds, which were ESG proof, they didn't lose that much money as the traditional funds during the crisis. So up until now, everybody was looking to underpin that these funds are better, they are easier to be financed, they are cheaper to be financed, and risk is lower because you know a lot of risk. And that was not always the case, and it's still a big question today whether that is true. But if we take the crisis and the collapse, then these funds were losing only half of their values compared to the traditional funds that were not having this ESG proof rating. So I think that's a very interesting momentum, that the interest didn't decrease, but it's still increasing. And you have a European regulatory framework for showing how to do that, how to do the issuance, also if you are a private company, also if you are a sovereign one. Then if you have this strategy and you have your projects, which are green projects, and you implement them, then the third step is about reporting. Every company, just like in the Canadian case, have to have disclosures of what they are doing. And disclosure is valuable and rich if you do something. So by the nature of having a strategy, implementing actions and green projects, you get to disclose these. The disclosure in Europe was not really successful so far. When we look at the non-financial reporting and some of the surveys that has been done in the last year. So just a couple of days ago, the European Commission was closing down a public debate on how to strengthen the disclosures, whether there should be additional guidances for the companies, how to report on special issues, or the threshold of the companies that have to report is also planned to be lower. So companies with an average number of 250 workers, they might also face the risk of getting into this regulation and having a compulsory way to report. So far, it's like 6,000 companies doing this reporting in the EU, and really there was a very poor performance described in these disclosures. Compared to that, I think in this September we will see a much stronger package. So, just to summarize, in the part of the economy, nothing really changed. Financiers, investors are still looking for green projects and ESG-proof projects. the market has a little backlash here, and the projects are not enough actually. So every sector, look at the transportation in the Hungarian case, can be greener, and the appetite is there to finance these projects if they can be brought to sunlight. And at the end of the day, the regulatory part, let it be the ESG ratings of the market and the underlying metrics in the EU taxonomy for sustainable finance, and also the reporting. This is all helping the companies to have a support and a supporting hand to know how to do that. So I think it's in a very good shape, and not only the developing world, but in the EU it's also coming up, and that's a good sign, because so far it was mostly sustainable finance, and ESG was used in the recent times in developing countries to make sure that those investments are better and there is no harm to the environment or the climate. In the EU, you have very stringent rules already that has to be leveled up for the next level. And I think that's a very good sign for people who invest or who are interested in the green economy.
I agree. And it's very hard to see significant CO2 reductions in anything in Europe compared to developing world. Because you're more far advanced in the transition, and I agree that it's important to focus on developing countries too, who don't have such stringent standards as we have in the EU. But also, as you said, reporting is really important. We cannot just let European companies go with their pollution, and you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So sustainable reporting is increasingly gaining momentum, I feel like. And also what we learned throughout your answer to a question is that green investments are really worth it. Green bonds are really worth it. And this is the future, and we should not look back to what we have done, I think, so far. Or we should definitely, but this is the future. So let's invest in green. Thank you very much for the answer to the initial questions. I have a few which have been posed in advance to the discussion via a Google form. And the first one is, I think it's more country specific. How would the current situation affect countries who are heavily relying on tourism? Even if you're not an expert in the sector, I think we can see quite a few interesting dynamics. Let's say Greece or Italy, or really those countries who are living out of tourism.
I think it's very interesting, because just recently I had the luck to look at two parts of the tourism, and maybe one is the mass tourism, let's call it like that, which is all around in the world. We are changing countries and going for weeks on holidays, and people who stay in 5-star hotels, staying in really those parts of the world in holidays where masses are coming. I think that part was really collapsing. If you could see, in many parts of the world, these economic sectors were going down. And everybody was looking for how to leave the house safely and where to be. So people found themselves in forests, in trails, in different parts of the world, and people started to regain their interest in the nature. So that's like there are two parts of tourism to my recent understanding. One was this mass tourism, which lost a lot in terms of GDP, and that GDP was contributing a lot to a country, the GDP, and the other was these active and ecotourism. So what I recall that in the last crisis, after the last crisis, for example, in Spain, the government started different programs on making hotels more energy efficient. And I think that if we look at the current crisis and how to get out of that for these sectors, there are, of course, different angles, like, okay, let's have more active and ecotourism type of spending. In some countries, it is reaching like 10% of the tourism GDP. So it's significant, and you can make it even higher if you're cycling, trailing, sailing, doing all type of stuff that is out in the nature. It can generate GDP still. But for the other part, you need energy and infrastructure and technology related improvement, because the world is not stopping. And if you can do that, then you are actually preparing for the future, optimizing your costs. And this was always the operational efficiency was always very important in such times of crisis. Otherwise, you can close down the business. So in tourism, I think we can see a lot of good examples on that around the world. Some nations were already holding great development plans for the tourism, and others were adding this up with safety packages of a COVID-19 stimulus.
I see. Thank you. And for sure, yeah, mass tourism has suffered a lot, and maybe it's time for us to rethink the way we travel or the purposes that we travel for. Thank you very much for answering this one. The next one got posed just recently. So do you think that the closer cooperation between business and government, the business and the governmental sector will last in the post-pandemic world, as we have seen increased cooperation due to the crisis, but this might not stay like this? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a pattern in every country. Like those sectors also in Hungary, which were important for our safety, they were getting quicker bailouts to stay stable. So I think if we mean by cooperation that one, then I think that's something that will last a bit longer, because the end of the crisis is not yet there. So if one sector, like let's take again the tourism, is able to generate in some way still the half of the income during this summer, then still during the winter time, if these are summer related sectors, then they have to be helped further to keep alive for the next year. So I think it differs on different sectors. It differs on from where you have higher consumption or you have a stable operation, like in energy. There is a little loss, and maybe those sectors will not be kept that long. But those sectors that have lost a lot and are still, let's say, burst to bring them back to a previous status, they will keep, I think, a longer tie to the governments.
Mm-hmm. I see. It makes sense. So another question, and I think this goes back, I have actually two, which refer to the European Green Deal to some extent. So Evelyn wants you to share your thoughts on the prospects of the green recovery in Central and Eastern Europe, so very region specific. Do you think that the Just Transition Fund of the European Green Deal could offer a credible opportunity for CE countries to phase out coal technology? And this is very energy specific. Very interested in what you're saying.
Yeah, I think just recently the European Commission has approved for 18 countries to receive funding to measure this, what it could mean, because it is not only, it's not really energy transition at the end of the day. It's a type of fuel switch, of course, but it is bringing more difficult issues with them, like how the society can adapt to new technologies. Like people living in these areas used to make a living out of connected to coal. So if you want to change those societies, that's not going to happen with an investment, but for that one you need different strategies and programs. So what I see, it is bringing it is very promising. The bills are not high enough. If we look at the case of Poland, if I recall correctly, there were around 1,000 billion of euros that they said they would demand to cover all the losses that has to be connected if they ought to come out from the coal industry with a scenario in 10 or 15 years of time. So I think it depends on member states in our region, how much it costs to change a power plant from coal to gas, or from coal to nuclear. And at the end of the day, you cannot really measure the impact yet on society and the economy. For that one, member states are currently drafting their plans to find out how much it costs and how to do that properly. But definitely, if you look at the potential of reducing CO2, increasing renewable energies in these countries, this is a big fundamental change, a fuel switch change of power plants that could happen, and this could help also other sectors to change their way of operations and how beneficial the investments are in those sectors.
Thank you. I myself, I'm researching this topic too. So what I would add is that it costs an enormous amount of money to decarbonize these industries, and the Just Transition Fund or the EGD will not alone solve this. So like an accelerated cooperation and effort from member states is needed. And also there are many aspects to the energy transition itself. For example, you mentioned Poland, where it's a societal issue. So there's miners' unions, there's coal miners who have been inheriting this position or this job from their fathers. It's destroying communities. So you cannot simply from one day to another do that, although you have to, and I think Poland, for example, is also very much aware of that. They are really struggling to get the funds to get their coal industry phased out. And also, but this could be a really good momentum for, I think, market gains for renewables. So we're increasingly seeing that it's becoming economically viable and desirable to install renewable energy plants and renewable energy facilities, because it's simply price-wise is better. So we will see big shifts in the market too. But for sure, a lot of the countries, including Poland and also including Hungary, because of our Matra coal plant, we do require this money, but it needs political efforts and all kinds of contribution from member states, which cannot be neglected. So there's a huge role of member states here. And a last question we have, it's also related to the EGD. Other European Green Deal actions to implement on a national level. I think so right now we have touched upon the energy sector, but maybe it's just briefly interesting to mention what other sectors really need decarbonization and how we are trying to reach this 2050 zero carbon goal. Because it's not only the energy sector, it's very easy it's easier to decarbonize the electricity sector, for example, than all others, including transport and buildings. But we also have to look to agriculture, to a lot of other sectors. So what do you think needs to be done here?
Yes, I think that the other sectors, if we look at the European Green Deal documentation, then we can see that there are significant efforts of other sectors. If you look at the agriculture, in agriculture, I think it's already back to this period of time in 2013 and 20 that the EU tries actually for a much longer time, but is trying in every period of the common agricultural policy to green the agriculture, to divert funding farmers on producing more and more crops, but rather producing more resilience and also producing the agriculture non-tangible goods for the rural development. So I think the majority of actually the new multilateral financial framework of the EU, the new budget, is actually connected in a big sense to the CO2 reduction in agriculture and in the food industry. So I think if we look at the food we waste and the energy that we waste by not reducing that food waste, is again getting back us a little bit to energy. So I would say that all the sectors are in a way coupled by their energy consumption to their ability and capability to change. Because if there is an energy consumption, then it makes it very easy to count on the cost and the price of how that fossil fuel can be phased out from that particular sector. So I think it's one of them. Then if we look at the circular economy and the circular economy action plan of the EU, it's also again very ambitious. If we look at one target, like how not to put much part of the waste into depots and also not to waste incinerators, then again you have a lot of raw material that you want to use in industry and recycle. That's again the question of commodities. One is about the energy, whether it's better to make energy by the waste incinerated compared to coal or gas. But then again, the other question is whether it's even more beneficial not to burn it at all, but to produce such raw materials that can be recirculated to production more times. So I think if we look at these policies, these are moving other sectors than the baseload energy. But if we look at the main challenge, I think it's not easy to change the energy sector. I would rather say that it's almost the last one to change, but it should have been the first to be changed, because IPCC reports are also telling us that the yearly cost of this change is dependent on the clean energy we can produce. Every sector will be consuming that. By that, you can make any sector cleaner than they are at this moment. But the other force maybe, but in that I think that there might be next year the proposals from the European institutions is the consumer. So we can develop ourselves by consuming differently, despite the fact that we are influenced by the products and services. Because that can make also the purchasing power of consumers to drive businesses higher. And I think this was seen in the COVID-19 crisis. People were trying to consume more consciously, not at the beginning of the first 2-3 weeks, everybody storing what they could. But right after that, people realized that what they purchase is too much. And I think that is something where that place of the society experienced who were already very conscious on sustainable consumption of goods.
I agree. This really shows us what is necessary to consume, what is not necessary to consume. And yeah, there has been a radical shift in our consumption patterns, which is sitting on the economies as we spoke. Thank you. Maybe I have a last question, and I know your field of expertise is ETS. So how about I wonder how the carbon prices are looking right now, and what has changed due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and just talk about how really ETS prices are involved in this whole process, because I think electricity prices rising due to ETS quotas and the EU potentially bringing in more sectors to the carbon trading scheme might also have a really big impact on our emissions and also contribute to our decarbonization goals.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because I just spent the whole day on a very fresh carbon markets conference, and I heard of many wise people who are looking at the price and also the drivers. So I think there are many views currently that show that the regulatory tools are behind the carbon price to trigger it even in higher fields. Like people in this conference in this morning have been voting on where they see the price to go, and today I think I was just checking it. It's around 22, 23 euros, and people see it for the end of the year above 26. So it's a kind of bullish, and experts tend to agree that there is no sign of the coronavirus on this market. And of course, there are regulatory instruments on place already and will be on place until the end of the next emission trading period, which are driving the price higher, but also the technological learning curves and the cost of new technologies are also driving this price by their nature higher and higher. So I think it was a surprise that it's in a good shape. The price signal is giving a signal to the investors to stay on their renewable markets. Of course, the low oil prices are a little bit challenging this, but definitely it's a bit of a surprise, but it's in a very good shape, and it seems to be a future and not a sign of collapse.
Mm-hmm. I see. 22 still sounds to me like really low, but I hope it will with time.
It's better than the 4 that we had, or 5 a couple of years ago. But also there are plans for the extension of the emission trading and the price of carbon to the full economies in Europe, which will also make the price reflect the emission reduction potential of those sectors. And I think that is also triggering other sectors to change. And there will be sectors who were there earlier, like the electricity sector, power and industry, who know how it works, and they might invest already into such sectors where this cap of emission is coming. So I think Europe is on a good way. However, we should say that Europe is only 11% of the emission of the world. So let's see if this is led by example. And of course, we have to also take care of the competitiveness of the EU, which is always a difficult issue to actually to handle, because you can be ambitious, but ambition can be very risky at the end of the day if you are losing jobs and if you are losing your competitiveness. So there is this carbon border adjustment tax that the EU is planning to include, but I think experts say that that is a bit more difficult politically to put through, and also technically. So it might not get off that quick, as opposed to actually we are driving higher the ambition in the European Union. Yeah.
I think for internal EU markets, for sure, it would be great. But I also would argue that in the EU, we are really, really stuck up in our heads, and sometimes not taking a step back and realizing that we're still very minor in the whole game. And it's good to look at the developing world, or good to look at other continents too, because the EU is not only the only player who has to decarbonize, and we're doing pretty good, I think. We got a last question, which pretty nicely sums up our whole talk series, actually. So someone asked, would you agree that COVID-19 has brought a need to rethink and redevelop strategies that can bring about a great economical, political, and environmental reset? If yes, what would be the immediate steps to initiate this reset for these three factors mentioned above? So economical, political, and environmental. I'm looking to you to summarize all our findings on the whole COVID-19 pandemic and sustainability. So is there a need for a reset? That's the question. And how?
I think that I would say that to develop strategies and redevelop them, yes, partly yes. Some sectors need to rethink, but it was, at least in the EU, just now, if we think now the governmental strategies here, not the company and corporate strategies, the EU has just collected from MB member state a national energy climate plan, which was reflecting their own strategies, the national strategies. So they were aligned on what they want to reach. So if we look at the strategies for renewables, energy efficiency, or the CO2 itself, then there is no need to redevelop them, because they were just developed. And by the way, they will reach their maturity and be achieved there will be better figures, I think, than we thought now, because the crisis has brought such changes to the economies that are better for these environmental figures. So for the environmental strategies, I don't think. To redevelop strategies in the economy, yes, definitely. If you can see, everybody tries to avoid such a collapse again, and there is a debate whether becoming more local is more resilient than staying global. So the economic strategies and the budgets are redrafted, and nobody knows what comes in September. So definitely to have a strategy for that, it's maybe I would say too late, or it's undefined. People are and I think economists are also looking at how such quick changes can be handled. And you can have a strategy, but you have to rewrite the next day. And I think people are really looking at this at the economy this way. In terms of political, I think that those voices where green directions are more important, they are gaining power in around the globe, and those plans that show that green recovery has new jobs, those voices are actually having their strategies reset. So I think partly it's right that that some strategies have to be rethought, but I would say this is like the economic one, and the political and environmental messages of those who already had it. This is kind of stable.
Thank you. I think we really touched upon a lot of things. Thank you for your last answer. This was the last question. So we touched upon sustainable finance, carbon trading, the European Green Deal, state intervention, a lot of topics. And I think the conclusion is that, yes, COVID-19's effects are staying with us, but there are really good takeaways from this, I think. We can learn a lot, and it's still not too late to change our paths, especially with regards to economic policies and how we organize our world economies. So thank you very much, Ákos, for very insightful answers. Thank you everyone for the really good questions also. And I would like to remind everyone that we have a fourth session next week, Wednesday, on 24th of June, where we'll gather all, hopefully you, Ákos, too, all speakers to a debate session. And we have a nice sum up debate about all the topics that we talked about. So hopefully see you next week. Thank you for the great talk, Ákos.
Thank you.
And thanks
Thank
for,
you, Csinszka, for that.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone for being here, and see you soon.
Thank you very much for everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.